Hello again, and thank you for staying with us. We continue here. South Africa took over the presidency of the G20 at the end of 2024. Since then, the world has become a more complex, unpredictable, and dangerous place. These developments have also raised concerns about how well mechanisms for global cooperation, such as the G20, can continue to operate, particularly those that work on the basis of consensual decision-making. So what's the G20's purpose? For more on this, we are joined by Kamal Ramburuth, who's the G20 Project Lead Institute for Economic Justice. Kamal, good to have you on the program this evening. So South Africa's G20 presidency comes at a moment of major global uncertainty. From your own perspective, what are the biggest geopolitical or even economic risks currently testing the effectiveness of the G20, if you will?
Thanks so much, Atlanta, and it's great to be here with you and all of your viewers at home. And as you said, the world is really facing unprecedented volatility. We are seeing the post-World War II global financial order unravel. We are seeing the global trade order unravel. We're seeing more wars in Europe, Africa, and Middle East, the highest number of conflicts since World War II. US and China tensions are escalating drastically and are reshaping the global trading system. There's been a huge increase in unilateral actions from various parts of the world amongst the most powerful countries. And of course, this is within the context of compounding crises, of climate crisis. We're seeing democratic backsliding. We are seeing huge technological shifts that are changing the way that we connect and organize ourselves in society. So it is a hugely difficult moment in which to host a multilateral meeting like this. The task is not as easy as it was, say, in 2019, before major conflicts between Russia and Ukraine, the occupation of Palestine by Israel, and the trade wars, the pandemic. All of these things have had huge impacts on the multilateral system. It would have been a kinder G20 to host if it was, say, in 2019 than it is today.
You describe this as a very difficult moment, but one article describes the G20 as a process rather than a set of discrete events. As someone working within that process, how would you characterize the strengths and weaknesses of this year's G20 machinery?
Thanks, Atlanta. I think, the reason it's a process, right, and not an event is because there's about 132 meetings that have happened so far throughout the year, starting with the first meeting in December last year. And there are, a number of working groups, about 8 working groups in the finance track and about 18 in the Sherpa track. And all of these working groups have, 3 or 4 meetings each throughout the year, and, week-long ministerial negotiations. And then each of these working groups kind of have outcomes, right? They'll have outcomes like non-binding principles on a certain topic. For example, in Task Force 2 on food security, there was the production of voluntary non-binding principles on excessive food price volatility. And, those kind of things will be developed. And then there's, of course, the ministerial declarations, which is what all ministers of the G20 on a given topic, for example, on disaster risk, the ministers responsible for that amongst the G20 countries, what they can all say in common. And this is not an easy task. And to be fair, I don't think that the success of South Africa's G20 presidency should be necessarily measured by the content always of these kind of output documents. And the reason for that is exactly what you mentioned earlier, Atlanta, is that these are consensus spaces, right? And what does that mean? It's unlike many forums in the UN, for example, where you put forward a motion and all countries get to vote, right, on a given issue. Here, it's consensus. So what that means is that, if there's 1 or 2 countries who completely disagree with something that's being said, for example, recently It was widely publicized in the media around Argentina's very conservative position in the Women's Empowerment Working Group, where they didn't want to discuss anything about gender equality, care, human rights, and these kind of issues. One country like Argentina in that working group could block the entire consensus, whereas a similar issue was discussed at the UN, and Argentina was the only country to vote against it. But of course, it had a majority because the rest of the world acknowledged how important gender equality is. For example, the G20 doesn't operate like that. And so you have to really get the agreement of all member states on a given issue in order to have any written or formal outcome documents from that working group. And the reason it's a process is because, from the task force 2 that I mentioned through to the Women's Empowerment Working Group, through to all of the, various working groups and task forces, they all produce outcome documents, and those are accumulated and they're brought together and they put into the leaders' declaration, which is being negotiated from tomorrow up until Wednesday by the Sherpas. And then, of course, on Saturday and Sunday, the leaders will ascend on Johannesburg, and hopefully at that point there will be a leaders' declaration.
Kamal, also interesting is that the G20's decisions are non-binding. So in practice, how much does that then limit the G20's ability to drive meaningful global economic reform, especially for developing countries like South Africa?
No, it's an excellent question. And I think part of, at the bottom of this question is really a question about what is the value, of the G20. And I think it's important to be clear about what it is and what it isn't, right? So that, expectations are managed. It really is a forum that's there for agenda setting, for understanding various positions, for sharing knowledge on various topics. It is a non-formal forum. There's no secretariat, there's no permanent secretariat, so there's no implementing agents. There's no office, G20 office, where there's people working to implement it. The implementation comes from both member states and how they implement the things that they've discussed in the forum in their local context, but also the G20 plays an important role as the 20 most powerful countries or consequential countries in the world in directing various other multilateral institutions to take action. So an example of this is the G20 might discuss in the finance track things to do with Basel, right? The financial regulation, international financial regulation, and they might make a recommendation to say that certain the MDBs, the multilateral development banks, they commit to scaling up financing in those MDBs, for example, or they might call on the WTO to reform in certain ways. So the real power of the G20 is that these are also consequential countries that are members of multilateral development banks. They're members of the Financial Stability Board. They're members, of the IMF, and they're very powerful members of these different forums. And so if they agree to something in these meetings, when they go to those forums, they can say, we've agreed to this, and then decision-making in those forums are accelerated based on the agreements. And of course, the big critique of this is that these are the biggest countries in the world. They are the industrialized or industrializing mostly economies, and therefore their interests as core and semi-core countries in the global order might be different to those of low and low middle income countries. And so what the South African government has done, in response to that is lobbied quite hard to have the African Union become a permanent member of the G20, which they did in Brazil last year. And we've also, seen South Africa invite a number of guest countries from around the world, including Algeria, Nigeria, and Egypt, who have participated in this year's G20 meetings.
Kamal, unfortunately, we have to leave it here as we've run out of time. Kamal Ramburuth, for giving us his time and helping us unpack these dynamics. A big thank you to him.